Apply Blockchain as a company, founded, as I said, 3 years ago. We have a company which is developing blockchain solutions for clients. And we've got a range of clients, over 20 now, which is a 50-50 split between startups and corporates. We've been selected for 2 years in a row now as one of the only small companies in Gartner's top 20 blockchain companies worldwide. So that's a real privilege, and they've done a lot of research on us and others in the industry. So that's really a kind of great accolade for us to have. As a company, we're a team of blockchain experts. We've got 40 people now based in London, most of whom are developers. And we've been developing solutions for some of the biggest companies worldwide. I'm going to show you some of the list a bit later. This talk's going to be about blockchain agnostic applications, and that's a really big topic for us. And I'm going to explain to you a bit about the landscape and why we think that's important at this stage. All of our solutions get audited by third parties, so we build them ourselves, but then obviously they get checked by others. We've developed our own framework over time as well, so we kind of build these applications and we have this layer in between, which is open and helps the applications be more agnostic of the underlying blockchain technology. I'm going to take you through that in a bit more detail as well. Before then, part of our journey, so we've been around for 3 years, 2.5, 3 years. 2 years in, one of our biggest clients, which is Shell, awarded us with a really large project and offered to invest. And we took the investment to be able to focus on the product side of things as well. We also received investment from a London-based VC called Calibrate, who's also in the audience here today. This is the team. So, as I said, a bunch of developers in Level 39 in Canary Wharf. So very much London-based and working with a lot of the big companies and some of the smaller startups in this region. And the clients are really a real range of companies. As you can see, it's a mix. Some of you might know some of the startups here. So BAB is a new type of bank for the underbanked. We've been working with Barclays around trade finance, KLM around tracing aircraft components. They're one of the biggest services of aircraft component parts in the world, and it's about proving provenance and for maintenance of those parts to increase safety. C2 is a company owned by all the airlines in the airline industry, and we've been building a drone registry with them, which I'll talk about a bit later. We've done work with Vodafone, Lloyd's Register, which is the International Registry of Ships. Shell I mentioned, United Nations World Food Programme, a great project called Building Blocks, which is about providing food vouchers to Syrian refugees in Jordan, and that's live with 100,000 refugees using it, and it saves them 97% of their banking fees for the UN. So a really great project over there. Satoshi is around commodity trade financing. Talysticks was invoice financing, which you see here today as well. Nuggets around consumer data privacy, and so on. So a whole range of different industries and different solutions, and it's really given us a lot of insight into what technology is around today, what you can actually build, and how you can take these solutions into production. And also on there is Signatize, which is a fantastic project, solving a really simple problem around managing signatory lists in a company, so who's allowed to sign on what, and sharing that with your counterparts. So really reducing fraud around what seems like a very simple process, but actually can potentially expose fraud. The way we look at blockchain is actually as a method of, or a special database that provides security through a group. So rather than just something being hosted by one organization or being in control of one organization, we feel that this is something that by having a group which each has a stake in controlling the database, and therefore would need to be compromised in order to compromise the database itself becomes more secure. So we secure it as a group. And that's really the underlying premise for blockchain end-to-end in cryptocurrency, but all the way through to corporate and banking. I mentioned Shell. So Shell, we went through an interesting competition with blockchain companies globally. We won the competition, and they've selected us to build the next generation energy trading platform for their traders, and also invested in the company, as I said. Lloyd's Register, we're looking at registration of ships, and this is the 300-year-old registry, which started here in London, which is used today to register new ships in certain classes, and then we look at all of the activity that happens to those ships throughout their lifetime, but initially the asset gets registered in their registry, and we're looking at how that can evolve using blockchain technology and actually make the whole industry more streamlined. KLM I mentioned with the parts servicing and provenance, and this is what we've been doing with CETA. CETA's, as I said, owned by the airline industry, and they've been looking at drones. And drone activity is expected to grow, especially commercial drone activity, expected to grow exponentially in the next few years. And the regulators, or the flight and the airspace regulators in the different countries are very concerned about how this is going to proliferate and the risks associated with it and managing it and controlling it and so on. And so we've come up together with them with a blockchain-based solution which would act as a registry for pilots and for drones, but also for the flights themselves. So flights would be authorized with flight paths, and then the drones will provide their location. And using the blockchain as a place to store this data, and then as evidence, we can see whether the drone flights are compliant with what the regulator has allowed or not. And the evidence is captured in such a way that it can then be used later to enforce it. That's really the value that blockchain brings to it. Rocket Space, we've been involved together with IBM in a project with the automotive industry. We've also been working with Toyota. API is a great project around what I like to think of provenance of people. So this is your CV, where you studied, where you worked. It turns out that 90% of CVs have something which is not quite true in them. And this is really a way of getting those that you worked for, or those who gave you your certificates, to enter that data, sign it, and put it in a blockchain where it's very difficult to change and defraud. And the idea then is to make the recruitment process more efficient for those who then take you on board and have your details. So this application, for example, is live. So this is a blockchain application. You can download the app in the Apple App Store and Android as well today. It's actually being used by Shell and Open University as well. Signatize, I mentioned earlier, is a signatory list management. So any company, big and small, looking for a way to manage its signatory list, but then share them with its counterparts in a way which can be proven that it's the original signatory list. If somebody leaves the company, they're no longer on it, so it's fresh, and any changes instigated that can be seen through the blockchain, so you can see that it hasn't been tampered with. Okay, so you've seen all the applications, or a subset of them, and I think it's fair to say that across the verticals, across industry, the projects I've shown you represent quite a good cut of what's being built using blockchain technology today. So why would you need to think about building something in a platform agnostic way? And what does that really mean? So in the beginning, we had Bitcoin. We're talking about 10 years ago. So we had the famous white paper by Satoshi Nakamoto, and we had a new type of, a new invention for digital money. Then came along Ethereum, and so this is very interesting, but actually the processes around money are quite complex. Wouldn't it be great if we could capture them in this same type of secure, distributed environment, decentralized environment? Wouldn't it be great if we could build applications on top of that money? And so Ethereum came along. And then Tendermint came, and a group said, well, that's fantastic, but actually, we think there'll be lots of private blockchain networks. So rather than having one public, we want to do the same thing. We want to modify Ethereum and make it private, and have all these little groups that work together, thousands of little groups, but use the same technology. And then Ethereum split, and Parity, started by one of the founders, went off and built their own Ethereum client. And then JP Morgan, again, modified the Ethereum code and created Quorum, because they thought privacy was very important. And then Consensus came along and created the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. And then Hyperledger came about, which is from the Linux Foundation, and Hyperledger Fabric, which is IBM, or sorry, it's open source. It's IBM, well, we're not really sure. Hyperledger Sawtooth, which we think is Intel, but is also in the Hyperledger group, but again is a completely separate technology and a completely separate blockchain. Iona, again, another one. Corda. So we've heard about this one. The banks got together and thought they need to create their own version of a blockchain to satisfy their requirements and their needs. And then Ripple came along and created another Swift. And then Digital Asset Holdings came along, and again servicing the capital markets this time, and created a completely different technology stack. And Chain came along to do the same thing. And Dash came along because it's a faster Bitcoin. And then Stellar came along because it's a faster Ripple. And Cosmos came along and said, well, actually, we need these blockchains of blockchains, networks of networks. And Polkadot came along, that's right, but we think you should use Polkadot for that. And Aeon came along and said, you do the same thing, but actually use Aeon. And then Quant came along and said, we're going to join all these blockchains together. And then Plasma came along and said, we're going to be able to scale Ethereum. And Raiden came along and said, no, use side channels instead. And there's something called Dragon Chain, which I'm not really sure what this is, but somebody told me I should check it out. And Neo came along and said, well, actually, we'll do the same thing, but in China. So everybody wants to do anything in China, you have to use Neo. And then EOS came along and said, well, actually, we've solved the scalability problems for everybody. Just use EOS. And BigChainDB said something similar. And Hashgraph apparently solved all the problems, but actually it's close, so we can't see it, so I couldn't tell you. And that's only a tiny subset of the platforms that are actually around today. There's actually, I think, every day or 2 days, I see a new one. Or somebody says to me, have you heard about that one? And it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It's a bit like the internet in the early days, when people were using it initially for email and for websites, and then started using it for video, and it was really slow. So can you imagine 1,000 groups coming along and saying, forget that internet, here's a much faster one. Right? So a completely different technology stack. But yeah, use ours instead. And that's kind of what's happened here. Which maybe this is natural evolution for a technology, but it doesn't make any sense for me as a technologist for this to actually be a sustainable ecosystem of completely different, incompatible platforms, where each one solves the problem slightly differently, and therefore creates its own complete stack. So part of the problem is that the landscape is also constantly evolving. So we're getting new platforms, and they're each solving things slightly differently. And the real thing for me is that at the end of the day, this is a network. So the way to get value out of blockchain is by having more people on it, right? To have the nodes distributed, but also more people using it, more people sharing information, more people transferring value, right? And most businesses deal with similar assets and similar value and so on. You have verticals and ecosystems, but at the end of the day, all these dots join together. So again, it doesn't make that much sense as a techie to have all these different pockets of completely different technology happening independently of each other. So if you're building a blockchain technology solution, what should you actually use? And what's going to be around in 3 years' time, because you're investing in this? So we think you should future-proof your investment. And that's how we build our solutions. So the first principle for that is to look at the lowest common denominator. So if I'm going to build a solution, how can I build it in such a way that it will work on as many platforms as possible? Because I don't really know where this is all going. And so we have an architecture where we can deploy it to any cloud, and we take some of the really important things in blockchain that we don't think necessarily have to be platform-specific, like key management, identity, privacy, anonymity. So some of the real features that you need in a blockchain application, we say, hang on, instead of using the platform-specific method for doing that, we can do that outside. So we keep the smart contracts really simple and generic so we can easily port them, and we handle keys and identity outside. And that's how we came up with Mantle. So Mantle is really an open platform that sits between the applications and the underlying platforms and solves some of these problems around identity, privacy, GDPR, and so on, but doesn't tie you to a specific platform. The other way around, it actually decouples you from the specific platform that you're using. And we've proven this in our lab with some of our customers, where we've got applications working, let's say, on both Ethereum and Hyperledger Fabric. And finally, with the no time I've got left, I'd like to just talk about Fern. Fern is something that is really the first product that we've come up with that's just like Mantle itself has come out of the work we're doing on all these projects. The problem we faced is something that actually I heard some of the panel talk about earlier, which is we've got these public blockchains, which are not really ready for use right now because they don't really scale, and they have other issues around compliance and so on. And we have these private blockchains, which are not really decentralized. And if we're honest with ourselves, if we're starting a blockchain company and deploying a solution to a private network, we control that network. And as long as one party really controls that network, they can take it down, they can defraud it, and so on. And so you might as well just be building on a database. But we're building these solutions, and we believe that they should work this way, and they should actually be decentralized. Right? So how do we take these private blockchain solutions and actually make them decentralized in a way that the companies that are building them and deploying them can be reassured that they're fully compliant and that they have all the checks and balances in place to actually use these solutions? And so what we came up with Fern was just building this ecosystem. The ecosystem has a whole lot of companies, a kind of new economy, if you like, of companies who will host nodes. So these are kind of miners for the corporate world, miners for real business. right? So these are companies that would offer effectively a node hosting service to the kind of clients that we have that we're building these solutions for, right? So the corporates and real businesses in this world. So we have this pool. Now within that pool, the corporate or the business can come along and actually identify and check all of the parties in there. So you could see that they're compliant, you could see who they are, you could do all of the supplier onboarding that you would do today, right? And ask for all those checks. But you wouldn't know which subgroup from that overall ecosystem is selected and providing services to you, right? So you wouldn't be able to, or a party hosting with a blockchain solution, it would be harder for them to defraud the network because they don't know who the parties are that are providing specific service to them, right? So they wouldn't be able to bribe them very easily, for example. Right, so what we're trying to do is bring some of the security from the trustless public blockchain world into these private blockchain solutions and really give them some of that credibility, decentralization, and security aspects that exist in the public blockchain world. And this is the way we're proposing to do it. And we're having some of the corporates now go through the process of actually absorbing this and working with it. And there are cases in the business world today where in trading, for example, you have counterparts who you know they're part of a group, but you might not know who the specific counterpart to your trade is. So there is precedent to this type of setup. And Fern, we've actually got a stand outside there, is actually running a token sale right now. It's a private token sale, and there will be a public element to it once the private stage is complete. And the idea is that anybody in this ecosystem will hold stake in that token. So it's a UK company. We haven't got a purist, real token model, we think, and that's actually going on, is actively going on right now. So if anyone's got any questions, we've got the Applied Blockchain stand and we've got the Fern stand as well. And because football's coming home, we're sponsoring watching the football here tonight on the big screen. So Fern is the sponsor of that this evening. So good luck to England.